VOW trains women in sustainable development and leadership, and it is focused on the ways in which the Canadian Voice of Women for Peace has provided women with the opportunity to learn about peace leadership, not only in regards to sustainable development and advocating for climate change policies with their governments that have the capacity to make the world a much more healthy environment, but as well the manner in which it uses peace education to educate young women on the ways in which they can employ their academic skills or their advocacy skills to lobby their governments to stop spending on militarism and instead focus on spending on social protection and social justice initiatives that will ensure that the world is a better place. So the impact of women's leadership in sustainable development and climate change is remarkably different than the impact of men's leadership because of the more so holistic manner in which they provide policies and they provide solutions for some of the world's biggest problems. My presentation is based not only on firsthand experiences by being someone who has presented at the United Nations Council for the Security of Women after being trained by VOW as a board member, but outside of firsthand experiences, this presentation is based on secondary resources, inclusive of the World Economic Forum's research on women in leadership, as well as inclusive of qualitative and quantitative research that shows the ways in which women's leadership has the capacity to reduce instances of violence against women or instances of policies being established that in general have a negative output for society as a whole. So the reality for women who engage in sustainable development agendas is remarkably different than women who don't. So the first part of this presentation will deal with women who choose to, trailblaze a path in leadership and sustainable development and the data relating to their capacity to be successful in doing so. I'll also review on a global basis sustainable development leadership too as well. So particularly focus on how sustainable development leadership in African countries can deal with issues related to economic downturn or social-based issues such as women in precarious situations on the basis of a change in climate that then results in a change in the financial sustainability for certain communities. The purpose of this presentation as well is to illustrate the factors hindering women from becoming leaders in sustainable development and the ways in which different countries around the world have resolved that issue. And as well, this presentation is meant to highlight the hidden issues impeding women's access to leadership roles. So issues such as self-confidence, access to academic funding, access to networking opportunities, as well as access to positions in which they can truly be leaders, whether that be in government, policymaking, and entrepreneurship. So I'm grateful for the opportunity to be able to present at this Women's Forum. I'm thankful to everybody who's taken the time to actually listen to me today. And with the 20 minutes that I have been apportioned, I will go ahead and get started with this presentation that focuses on women in leadership and women in sustainable development. So women in leadership is good for the planet because of the holistic approach women take when they're in leadership roles. The holistic approach is on the basis of women completing care work at a large percentage in comparison to men, and typically being unpaid for such care work. As such, the nature of the strategy and policies developed by women when they are given a problem to solve is quite different from the nature and paradigms used by men when they're given a problem to solve. So if men and women led our world in an equal measure, supported by science and evidence, the question becomes, would our planet and the decisions we make for future generations be different? The Canadian Voice of Women for Peace has elevated young women to have the capacity to take on leadership roles in sustainable development and advocating for climate change. They've done so particularly by training young women to be able to attend the United Nations Council for the Security of Women as peace delegates, where they inform other member states or other civil society organizations about the ways in which the world can be improved for social protection for women in general. Now, while we're starting off with sustainable development, it's important that I touch base on the manner in which VOW's training of young women as delegates to the UNCSW helps create a model for peace leadership training for women, and also creates a model in which we see what types of policies would be implemented if women took on a leadership role, particularly in sustainable development. Now, one concrete example of what has occurred from VOW's training of young women in peace leadership initiatives is the creation of several other groups that are focused on ending climate change, which would be destructive to precarious communities. Now, one example is the creation of the African Climate Action Initiative. So that was an organization that was established, birthed from one of the members of the Canadian Voice of Women for Peace, who've advocated for young women to not only learn more about how climate change would affect our environment, but also take on a leadership role in doing so. So women's leadership is good for the planet because they train other women with the information to be leaders themselves, and with the strategy to create policy groups that will implement those changes in society for the benefit of us all. In particular, the African Climate Action Initiative then focused on dealing with the economic changes and social changes created when temperatures begin to rise in already very hot African states. And in temperatures rising in some of these states, that is the difference between the capacity to be able to earn from agriculture, which actually is negatively affected by changes in climate and changes to the weather at a heightened rate. So what VOW's peace leadership and peace education has done is empower women to then set up groups and organizations like ACAI, or collaborate with groups like ACAI for the purpose of alleviating some of the negatives that come from climate change, particularly in precarious African states and communities. Sustainable development has to be not only aware of gender. So when I note this, I am actually quoting from a secondary resource, a research paper that indicates that there are differential impacts that are caused by climate change and natural disasters. They are entirely different for men and for women. Now, some of this information was gleaned as well from the UNCSW, where some women shared their own experiences with having to deal with things like war, for example, or political uprising, for example, that's happening in Mozambique. Now, when things like natural disasters, political uprisings, violence occurs, the experience of women is entirely different from the experience of men, typically because of their role as caregivers in the home and their more so vulnerability in society as being individuals who are either dependent on another person as the breadwinner, or being the breadwinner themselves for their family. So gender-aware sustainable development has to take into consideration the differences between the lived realities of women and the lived realities of men. So according to the IPCC in 2018, the climate change scenario is deemed to worsen, and women in leadership positions are pivotal in alleviating some of the negative effects of that occurring. We saw that in the pandemic, where in Ontario, there were, for example, several reports that during the pandemic, the instances of violence against women or the instances of certain criminality in relation to gender-based violence actually increased. And what we actually experienced was organizations like the Canadian Voice of Women for Peace and the Barbra Schlifer Clinic taking a leadership role in setting up information webinars and seminars in order to disseminate education to stop that issue. So in regards to being stewards of natural resources and in regards to the climate change debate and in ensuring environmental sustainability, women are uniquely positioned as stewards of natural resources. So prior, I mentioned the vulnerable state of certain African states, in particular to the changes in climate change, the changes due to climate change, and the work that the African Climate Action Initiative did in order to alleviate those issues, or at least bring a global awareness of those issues so that solutions can be designed by different foreign policy offices. Well, this information that's on this slide is essentially in support of the on-the-ground work that women do, particularly to sustain their communities and in general, their societies around the world, particularly in rural communities. So, for example, the crops that women tend to grow and focus on in more so agriculture-focused states than industrial states, such as rice, corn, millet, and legumes are most likely to be crops that are purchased around the world and used significantly. Women are deeply involved in growing food for consumption as well as for export, and over 40% of agricultural workers are women. So the reason why this information is relevant is that in the sustainable development strategy for the global community, women in each and every country across the world have to be pivotal in the development of policy. They also have to be leaders too as well in engaging in sustainable development, because on the ground, they are most likely to feel the effects of climate change and environmental disasters. As such, they have the knowledge of what the solutions would be to alleviate such problems. So the almost exclusively male list of past winners of the Sustainable Development Leadership Award given by the World Sustainable Development Summit exemplifies the issue of the difference between men in leadership roles relating to sustainable development and women in leadership roles relating to sustainable development. So if we look at leaders or look at the leaders that currently exist on the world stage, for example, there are few and far in between that typically speak quite often about how climate change can be alleviated without needing extreme pushback. And one example is Greta Thunberg, who's quite well known for speaking up about sustainable development and the horrors of the destruction of our planet due to climate change. Of course, there are several other individuals, women, who are racialized too as well. For example, the director of the Sustainability Development Office in Canada, and Sarah Kwamu, who is the director of ACAI. However, when these women speak up, they typically are not met with, I guess, accepted in the manner in which men would be accepted for bringing this information forth. So at a government level, national and even more so municipal, women leaders are also associated with less debts and faster action in implementing policies that will resolve any negatives related to climate change and sustainable development. So if the issue that we are facing is that on a day-to-day basis and in our lives, practically the leadership of women in establishing policies to deal with climate change, sustainable development, and environmental sustainability is minute or is quite rare, then the issue is how do we have there be a balance between men and women in the upper echelons of leadership, inclusive of government, parliament, or the Senate or Congress. According to the Women's World Atlas, only 4 countries have achieved parity between women and men in parliament. And the world is completely absent of countries in which public limited companies reporting to investors have an equal number of women to men on their boards. So in the private sphere, where an executive group has the capacity to influence society on the basis of how much money they generate and how much people they employ, the data shows that women hold very few leadership positions in large private conglomerate organizations. And then even on the public sphere, there's only 4 countries in the world. And as you know, there are many, many countries across the world that have achieved an equality, or at least seemingly gender parity between men and women. So in our engagements with each other on an international level and on a national level, there's only 4 countries publicly that have committed to actually achieving gender parity. And in the public sphere, it's very rare. So that means if a company is going to make a company that's a conglomerate and a large private institution is going to make a decision that may affect environmental sustainability, there are very few women executive leaders that would be on the board of directors or part of the executive team that would advise on the decision being made in a way that takes into consideration the lived experiences and the systemic inequalities that women would have to face in particular. So that lack of leadership in the private sphere and on a very rare basis in the public sphere trickles down into the policies that we deal with on a day-to-day basis. And so in regards to the gender gap that even exists, according to the World Economic Forum's 2021 Gender Gap Report, the pandemic has set the representation of women leaders back by 68%, a trend reversal that will impact more than 50% of the population. And if women leadership traits are proving to be more effective, at this point in our history, what can we do to ensure the insight of women leaders that benefit our institutions in the future? Now, this slide is on the basis of the World Economic Forum analysis of the ways in which the pandemic shifted women's leadership, particularly in gender and gender-based policies and in environmental sustainability. And in order to actually ensure those leadership traits continue to be developed, it would mean that private organizations and public organizations would need to hire and retain more women within their executive levels and within their decision-making and leadership levels in order for their intellect or their understanding of the nature of different social issues to be used to resolve those problems. So some of the leadership traits in which women have and outscored on men are inclusive of taking initiative, learning agility, inspiring and motivating others, developing others, building relationships, displaying high integrity and honesty, and communicating powerfully and prolifically. So the data collected by the World Economic Forum actually shows women score quite highly on certain traits that are necessary to be a good leader. So it isn't an issue of women lacking the competencies to be great leaders then. It's then an issue of how are women brought into the fold and into the social structure in which they can then provide resolution to things like climate change related disasters and environmental sustainability. So the Canadian Voice of Women for Peace, like I've mentioned, is an example of a group doing just that. We have worked, for example, in the year 2023 to set up meetings with the United Nations Ambassador for Canada, Bob Ray, in order to actually ask questions about what Canada is doing in order to ensure that carbon emissions are reduced or are controlled across industries. So within that meeting, this civil society organization with longstanding ties to UNESCO set up a meeting with a government executive in order to, and well, the UN ambassador, in order to ask about an actual policy and to check in about whether or not industry members or companies are meeting the standards set by the Canadian government. Like, this action in itself is an accountability action that shows how women's leadership in environmental sustainability it can actually be strategically used in order to ensure that our planet is as healthy as it is for as long as possible. So female founders are also building everything from nanofiber-based medical devices that will help the human body heal itself, ride-hailing e-commerce platforms connecting communities, helping them to thrive, as well as becoming funders and funding all women's initiatives in medical healthcare and in global health. So women's leadership is key in building a sustainable and inclusive future, but it's also transferable in private sector where women start companies, whether that may be to deal with global health or to advocate against climate change, or in the public sphere where civil society organizations and non-governmental organizations consistently advocate with government bodies and with international organizations to implement policies that will actually make the world a better place. And by better place, we mean less poverty from coming from climate change and terrible environmental sustainability policies, and ensuring that the health crisis due to the COVID pandemic, for example, was alleviated. Women took a very active role in that leadership phase. So women bring a different perspective, and they also bring a different lived experience, which is critical to adequately framing challenges and developing solutions. When women are at the table, the results are different, and the potential impact can be even greater. In global health, only 25% of top leaders are women. And like I mentioned before, with the development of women's entrepreneurship and leadership, the examples that I gave show that some of the female funders actually particularly focused on investing on women's health. So rather than investing mostly on gaming or investing on things that may be deemed as more mundane, women funders in particular actually put money into initiatives or companies that would either heal people with illnesses, deliver social programming, or deliver community-based programming in some shape or form. So when women make decisions, even in regards to which companies that they fund, they make those decisions very differently, with the focus on health more so than male investors. So countries with higher proportions of women in parliament are more likely to ratify international environmental treaties, to create protected areas, and to have stricter climate change policies. Countries where women enjoy greater social and political status have lower emissions and climate footprints. So this data is basically aligned with the fact that if there are more women in leadership positions, especially in public institutions inclusive of government, then countries that have established that gender parity also have reflective data in areas such as climate change policies, gender-based violence policies, pay equity, and international environmental treaties. And one example is with Canada, which has a very I guess, a better gender parity within its governmental institutions than other countries. And that is reflected too in the 2022 UN Ocean Conference, where the Minister, I believe, of Natural Resources and the Environment was able to communicate the wealth of policies that have been developed in line with other countries and nationally to protect large bodies of water and to alleviate any issues that would come from environmental damage from private institutions doing work in Canada. So countries with more gender parity have more actual laws and regulations that protect the environment and that protect women as well. And we also see this in peace leadership, of which VOW has taken a leadership role in educating women with the inner work necessary, the knowledge and the community and the environment in order to ensure that environmental sustainability is top of mind for leaders, regardless of what the event may be that a female leader may be advocating at. So not only is women's leadership great for sustainable development of the environment, it's also essential to developing peace leadership, non-violent social movements advocating against climate change or advocating against industrial practices that negatively impact our communities and our society as a whole. So the barriers that women leaders deal with can be institutional. They can also be social. Everything from being the expectations to being a caregiver and more so a leader of the home, which stops women from then developing academically or socially, or even having the time for networking opportunities, despite having the intellect to be able to lead for some of these organizations that actually advocate for environmental sustainability. So the barriers for women leaders are quite far-reaching. They're inclusive of systemic-based barriers, institutional-based barriers, financial barriers, depending on a person's economic capacity to earn, that actually stops a woman or from becoming a leader or being able to join organizations where they can advocate for environmental sustainability. So the patriarchal structures sort of constrain women from becoming leaders. That's one of the positive reasons why we see more barriers for women leaders. And then there's also issues relating to self-confidence, which comes from socially being told from youth about the role of a woman, which can be entirely different than what a girl can do. So a girl can do anything, a woman can do anything, but if, for example, in a hypothetical, you are growing up in a community where your role is simply defined as being someone who is a mother or caregiver, rather than being a mother caregiver and also a leader and also someone who is an executive in some capacity, what happens is women's understanding about the scope of their leadership capacity is oftentimes limited depending on the communities that they grew up in and the access to funding or academics that they have. And finally, masculinity can also be a barrier, or it can be a tool for helping women leaders in sustainable development. So as noted, women play an essential role in economic development. I mentioned on one of the slides before, in most countries across the world, they actually work on producing agriculture and most of the food that we eat and that is exported. And typically women focus on the most, I guess, financially lucrative agriculture too. So not only are they stewards of their environment, but they're stewards financially and economically of their families at times. So my other main point is that in regards to women leaders playing a role in economic development, there are unequal access to economic opportunities for women. And even when women have access to jobs, for example, the data shows that they are paid on average approximately almost 13% less than men are. And in different countries, that percentage changes too as well. So what's at issue with women leadership is the lack of access to similar financial opportunities. So one of the case studies that I wanted to focus on was the implications of shifts in African crop climates by 2050. So this case study is uniquely focused on how women's leadership, particularly economically with agriculture, is negatively affected by estimated changes in climate. And that negative change, something as small as the temperature increasing by 3 to 5%, will have an impact on the financial impact that women can make in these communities, which then proves the point that women taking a leadership role in sustainable development as well in government will mean that they would be able to set up policies in developing countries in Africa and the Middle East to ensure that there is a social and financial cushion for the health burden and the financial burden that would come from climate change and environmental contamination. So there has been a development of the understanding of the substantial threats that climate change poses to agriculture. But there hasn't necessarily been a similar plan on how to respond. So, for example, Africa's slow economic growth for certain countries has actually been linked to low rain, so low precipitation. So the economic issues in regards to agriculture has been estimated to be linked to the weather. So the Barrios study from 2010 establishes that connection between changes between the climate and financial issues developing in certain African states. So the projected temperature increase to 2050 in the case study that I'm using notes that there will be approximately a 2 to 5% increase in temperature on average for African countries. So that then also as well not only affects children's capacity or students' capacity to perform in school, workers' capacity to perform at work due to how uncomfortable the heat will actually get. But it then also affects the human capital and production process, in that in the development of intellectual capacity, if the weather is changing at such a rate that it makes it unlikely for individuals to remain indoors or also to grow crops that will be financially lucrative, it can only be estimated that there will be a long-standing negative effect. One way to resolve that is to have women in leadership positions in government and in civil society in order to start developing policies to, one, not only provide other avenues for education, but also grow crops that will be able to survive the changes in agriculture, but also be able to deal with some of the social ills that comes from climate change. So in particular, there is also a study that showed that in certain Tanzanian villages, when there was a change in the weather that resulted in less agriculture or less financial sustainability, there was an increase in gender-based violence, particularly against women. And it was noted that it was the witch murders is what it was called. However, regardless of whether you believe in the assessment of these women as being witch murders, the purpose of that study was to show that as the temperature and climate changed and affected certain communities and villages negatively, women had to pay the price. If more women are in leadership positions, even within those communities, they have the capacity to engage in peace education or education relating to climate change that helps those communities understand that those changes within the weather aren't necessarily issues relating to women or shouldn't be the burden of women to bear. But it's also reflective about the sort of role of stewardship and leadership that women take, even if it's in a more submersive role due to the patriarchal systems that exist across the world. So as well, we note that gender inequalities are exacerbated by climate changes. And that is the purpose of me providing that information in regards to the Tanzanian increase in gender-based violence on the basis of the changes in climate. So higher temperatures increase civil war risk in sub-Saharan Africa, according to a study by Burke as of 2009. And according to another story, higher temperatures actually correlated with more violence, raids, clashes, and battles since 1990. So the solutions are to these issues that I've sort of noted, in that there's an increase in violence, increase in financial instability on the basis of climate change. How does that translate to this investing in women in leadership and women in sustainable development? Well, investing in affordable and effective interventions to reduce the burden of mortality, morbidity, and disability can only happen by investing in women, because women are uniquely positioned to deal with the mortality of their family members, any disabilities that will occur, and the day-to-day caregiving that they are actually leaders of within their families. As well, investing in women in leadership roles, even despite the changes to the climate and despite the changes that may occur to environmental sustainability, would mean investing in health services and financing of health services. As we noted earlier prior, in private institutions, women who are funders are more likely to invest in healthcare, and as well in public-based leadership roles. Women who are in leadership positions oftentimes put a focus on caregiving, social protection, and healthcare too as well. So to resolve some of the negative social changes that would be caused by climate change, looking at different African countries as a case study is a good way to learn about why it's extremely important to invest in women's leadership and to ensure that environmental sustainability is a part of government policies and initiatives to make the world a better place. I'm grateful for the time you've spent listening to me, and my name is Oyeyinka Oyelowo, and I'm a board director with the Canadian Voice of Women for Peace and counsel for Chin and Orr Lawyers. Thank you.